According to the Ukrainian General Staff, Belarus is preparing for a large-scale reception of military echelons from Russia. In other words, trains filled with thousands of Russian soldiers and military equipment that are all heading towards Belarus. And local Belarusian telegram channels are reporting that Russian troops are beginning to arrive en masse to the Belarusian city of Gomel. And there's another thing we can notice that led to many questions. The vehicles of this joint Russia-Belarus force have a new symbol painted on them, a white triangle with a 2. What does it mean? Does it stand for anything? Or just them trolling? Truth be told, Ukrainian intelligence officers take this threat, this possible threat, very seriously. They're checking for all the places where Russian troops and military equipment were disembarked at railway stations within Belarus. They also notice how the enemy is carrying out a lot of repairs at unloading and loading platforms, as well as the construction of new roads leading to these platforms at train stations. We can't believe that the only reason this is done is because they expect to receive even more troops and equipment in the coming weeks. Ukrainian intelligence officers also notice how Belarusian guards are securing shunting locomotives. These are essentially the machines that pull the trains at railway stations. And lastly, they're taking a close look at the schedules of the trains for the movement of Russian military equipment on Belarusian railways. What does it all mean? Are we facing an impending threat from the northern front? This is what some Ukrainian telegram channels claim, that this is another preparation for an assault on Ukraine from the north, and perhaps another attempt against the capital, Kiev. Others, like the Institute of the Study of War, believe that the Kremlin is using Russian troops in Belarus to fix Ukrainian troops near Kiev. In other words, it's a bluff to divert Ukrainian forces from southern Ukraine and stall their offensives. But could it be that Russia is preparing something more elaborate? Let's explore all these options together. Hello my friends and welcome to History Legends. Here are the latest news about the Russo-Ukrainian war. As always, information changes by the hour, so if you have any new information, just comment it below. If you're new to this channel, make sure to subscribe and check out my Ukraine playlist so you don't miss anything I've said in the past. And as you know, just like with many other commentators, a lot of my Ukraine videos have been targeted with limited or no ads. So make sure to check out my Patreon and PayPal to keep the show running. Thank you to everyone that has already helped. And welcome to the headquarters concentration of forces. What started the entire thing was a footage from a train arriving in Belarus at night a couple days ago. What seems strange to me is that the soldiers we see on screen don't seem to be these elite badass infantrymen. You know, they look kinda old, not fit. You know what I mean, right? According to the Ukrainska Pravda, on October the 10th, Alexander Lukashenko announced that the Russian Federation and Belarus had agreed on the deployment of a joint regional grouping of troops, and more than 1,000 Russian troops should be arriving in Belarus. 1,000 troops doesn't seem too excessive, and this information was also confirmed by the Kiev Independent. That yes, Belarus did say that these Russian troops were part of a new military structure. But overall, 1,000 men is not that much, right? Yeah. But here's another train that arrived, and one of the Russian soldiers said on camera, "We arrived from central Russia. I'm from Moscow. We came to help strengthen the border so that everyone feels how united the peoples of Belarus and Russia are." As of now, there's nothing strange or worrying, and it seems very official. You might say it's just one train footage, but there have been many more footages of trains moving around the country just in the past few days. Here's a new video showing transfer of Belarusian military equipment in Fanipal, 15 kilometers southwest of Minsk. Here's a convoy of BTR-82s and BTR-80s entering Belarus. As many as 6 Russian MiG-31 aircrafts armed with hypersonic missiles flew over the city of Minsk, the capital of Belarus. Not only that, but a member of the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Alexei Gromov, was worried that the Russian Tupolev Tu-23M3 long-range bombers attacked the territory of Ukraine from the airspace of Belarus. And according to him, the start of these strategic airstrikes from Russia started from Belarus in August. Here's a Belarusian military convoy heading to the town of Ivanovo, located around 10 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. From the direction of Minsk, going eastwards, a train with T-72A tanks. Some reports claim up to 30 units. in at least 28 Ural trucks. Another train was spotted in the Belarusian city of Orsha, with UAZs, MAZs, and Tor M2 surface-to-air missile launchers were also transported. And that brought a lot of confusion. Some claim that Russia is sending military equipment to Belarus in preparation for an invasion. Meanwhile, Belarusian opposition says that Belarus is actually sending tanks over to Russia, as well as a lot of other military equipment. And it's true that several echelons of the Belarusian military were in fact sent to the Russian Federation. So yeah, it could be true, but for what purpose? Just don't forget that Belarus has over 600 tanks, models T-72 and T-80, and roughly 1,000 infantry fighting vehicles or armored personnel carriers. Now, according to Ukraine's general staff, this footage we just saw, where 20 T-72 tanks from Belarus were sent towards the Russian region of Belgorod. We can analyze this in several ways. To me, it could mean that these vehicles stayed in storage for so long that they actually need maintenance and repair. And that's perhaps why they're sent to Russia, because this is where they have all the equipment and the crews to refit them for combat. Of course, all these Belarusian armored vehicles could also join the front in Ukraine to replenish Russian equipment losses. One thing is clear, there's a lot of activity in Belarus these days. The Telegraph even reported that 9,000 Russian soldiers are now in Belarus. American political strategist Jason Smart. You don't have a last name like that for nothing, right? He says that according to Belarusian sources, at least 20,000 Russians are concentrated at the Belarusian-Ukrainian border, and that many people on the ground reported waves of trains filled with military personnel entered Belarus from Russia. To make matters even more worrying for Ukraine, Lukashenko said that the regional grouping of troops from Belarus and Russia would include 70,000 Belarusian troops. I don't know how, because that's more than all the military personnel of the Belarusian armed forces. But if this information is true, and he's not trolling, then for sure Belarus will have to use not only its conscripts, but they will also have to call back part of their 340,000 reservists. So watch out for such news. Lukashenko also added that 10,000 to 15,000 Russian troops will join this grouping, which is pretty close to what Jason Smart reported. So at this point, this joint force could be as strong as 85,000 men. And women, of course, I don't want to have any problems. 85,000 men and women. And as reported by the Polish media TVP World, the deputy head of the Belarusian government in exile, Paweł Latuszko, said that between 25,000 and 100,000 Russian troops may have been invited to participate in the exercise in Belarus. Okay, we have to take this information with a handful of salt, but we can't ignore it either. Perhaps they expect a lot more troops to come in the next few weeks. He went on to say that for Ukraine, this will be a difficult situation, and that Ukrainian general staff should preempt it by deploying a large force in northern Ukraine next to the Belarusian border. And many of these Belarusian and Russian troops are reported to be hidden, camouflaged in the forest near the border. And entry into these areas by civilians is also prohibited. A well-done bluff. Belarusian news claimed that Belarus doesn't intend to attack Ukraine. However, if Ukraine attacks Belarus, then they claim that Ukraine, I quote, will get an immediate and harsh response. But how much can Belarus be trusted? Could Belarus organize a false flag to push them into the war? But personally, what doesn't make sense to me is, why is Belarusian military equipment and vehicles going to Russia, but Russian troops and infantry going to Belarus? It is very possible that Russia's plan is very simple. Use Belarus and its military installations to train their new wave of mobilized personnel and perhaps even conscripts. This would force some diversion of Ukrainian resources towards the border, even without having to recross the Ukraine border anytime soon. There could be a fair amount of benefits for Russia. As of now, from what we've seen, not many Russians were sent to Belarus. For example, we saw one train with 7 wagons. That means roughly 700 to 1,000 men at full capacity. It's really not a lot. And hold on, if we look at this footage, there's not that many Russian soldiers either in that one. This huge Russian grouping is 7 men deep, and 22 wide. That means 154 men. You can round it up to 200 if you add the music, band, and all this. But perhaps this could just be the beginning. Belarus's military bases can house and train thousands of Russian mobilized troops, and this small contingent could pin down a significant amount of Ukrainian units at the border with Belarus, far away from the main front. The director of the New Geopolitics Research Network in Kyiv said that with the threat of a fresh attack from the north of Ukraine, Moscow could pin down several brigades of Ukrainian troops, some 30,000 soldiers that could otherwise be engaged in offensive operations in the east and south of the country. Now, this small Russian force would also be used for propaganda purposes, as a symbol of union between Belarus and Russia, but also as a possible deterrence against an uprising in Belarus, essentially as peacekeepers to protect Lukashenko's regime. Especially when the Atlantic claims that Lukashenko is easier to unseat than Putin because of all the internal opposition to Lukashenko's regime in Belarus. The head of the Belarusian KGB said that Ukraine had trained up to 300 Belarusians to take over one of the regional capitals of Belarus. And we also know that a significant amount of Belarusians are fighting as foreign fighters in Ukraine. But here's another option I thought of. It could be an exchange. Let's say 1,000 Russian mobilized personnel for 1,000 well-trained Belarusian soldiers going to fight in Ukraine, perhaps as mercenaries under the banner of the Wagner PMC. I don't think that Belarusian soldiers and conscripts are that well paid, so there could be a financial incentive to do so. So if the rumors are true that Russia is to send 15,000 mobilized personnel to Belarus, 15,000 Belarusians could join the front. It would be a win-win situation. Kyiv, round 2. Overall, it's very hard to guess what Russia is up to, especially since they have this new commander-in-chief, Sergei Surovikin, who seems to be very determined to turn things around. But let's explore what Russia could achieve if they actually launched an attack from Belarus. But once again, as a disclaimer, for the moment Belarus has not concentrated its forces and its posture looks defensive. So before Belarusian troops actually engage in combat under Belarusian flag, it's not going to happen overnight. But it's clear to Lukashenko that if Putin falls, his regime is also on the line. So it just makes sense that the Belarusian army, his army, could also help Putin's army. At the same time, when there are a lot of random numbers, especially big numbers thrown around, it could very well be BS, a bluff. But thing is, a good bluff is when the menace, the threat, is impossible to ignore. Kyiv is only between 100 kilometers and 140 kilometers from the Belarusian border. And despite the Ukraine victory during the Battle of Kyiv in spring, it's not the moment to be overconfident. It would be very unwise to start underestimating enemy forces. So Ukrainian officials immediately reacted. It was reported that all the bridges between Ukraine and Belarus have been blown up, and that all the roads in between both countries have been layered with multiple lines of anti-tank mines. And lastly, cadets, territorial defense, and National Guard units have been deployed to the border. Troops that could have been useful to continue the offensive in southern Ukraine. The threat is real, according to certain reports at the G7 summit. Zelensky even asked to deploy a peacekeeping mission between Ukraine and Belarus. The border is 1,000 kilometers long. Imagine how many Ukrainian troops could be diverted just to secure this entire area. And what's also worrying is that Belarus is undergoing a serious modernization of the railway as well as of the whole infrastructure. Some claim that within 2 months, the whole reconstruction should be completed. This could suggest that the Kremlin plans to move a lot of manpower to Belarus, and this way hit 2 important directions of Ukrainian logistics. One, an attack from Volyn to cut off Western arms supplies. I already made a video about a possible Belarusian intervention, so make sure to check it out. And another attack against Kyiv. This would be the only way to force Ukraine back to the negotiation table. And in case of a Russian victory, this could act as a fait accompli for the West. I told you, it's not wise to underestimate your enemy. The Russian grouping in Belarus could have learned from its past mistakes. Instead of attacking Kyiv with 25 to 30,000 men in 2 axes that could not mutually support each other, they could mass 100,000 men at one section of the border, and just with sheer strength, like a bulldozer, break through the border, and then using these 3 roads you can see on the map, reached Chernihiv. During the February invasion, they never managed to take hold of the city. In this scenario, they would not besiege it like in February and March, but they would immediately storm it no matter the cost. Once Chernihiv and its surroundings are secured and turned into a supply center, Russian forces could push south, one grouping towards Desna and another towards the infamous Brovary. In my opinion, the main grouping would be along that axis. It's a highway in open terrain, and there are very few natural obstacles like rivers and bridges along the way. The Dnieper would protect the right flank, and a lot of troops would be able to defend the left flank from enemy raids and attacks. This is why I think Ukraine should immediately prepare a second line of defense at the line Desna, Oster, Kozolets. This position is strategic because Oster lies in between two rivers, and the town controls the only bridge in between both axes of the Russian advance. Of course, this is a hypothetical scenario. If the Russians manage to break through this strong point, the next objective would be Kiev. The Desna grouping could immediately push south and form a bridgehead over the Dnieper by crossing over the Vyshhorod hydroelectric power plant. Meanwhile, the main grouping could attack Brovary and the eastern suburbs of Kiev. Now, a key feature of this attack would be the destruction of the bridges along the Dnieper, either through missile strikes, airstrikes, or artillery fire. This would considerably reduce Ukraine's capabilities to send supplies and reinforcements to their East Bank grouping. Again, this is not what I want, but this is what the Russians could potentially aim for. Of course, Russians could also attack Western Ukraine to cut off weapon deliveries, ammo supplies coming from Poland. Such an offensive, if victorious, would be devastating. But the main problem is the distance that this Russian grouping would have to cover. 250 kilometers to reach Lviv and 300 kilometers to reach Ivano-Frankivsk. Honestly, doesn't seem that realistic. And like I said in my previous video, there's always this risk of escalation in that Polish troops get involved, and then NATO, and then World War III. That's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to keep the show running, make sure to check out my Patreon and PayPal. The links are in the description.